going to start in a minute. I know we can't see each other, but we will have more than 100 people join us tonight. So let's really, for now, let's utilize the chat function and drop in the chat your name, your pronoun, where are you calling from tonight? And also, if you like, you can share which organization that you are affiliated with. Yeah, welcome. We're gonna start in a minute. Welcome, everyone. We're gonna start in a minute. Please, for now, let's use the chat function to introduce ourselves to everyone here. We have more than 100 people joining us tonight. And I would just also make a note that we will disable the chat function once our program starts to give undivided attention to all of our speakers. But throughout the webinar tonight, I encourage you to drop all your questions in the Q&A box. And before we end our program tonight, we will have a chance to address some of these questions. All right, so welcome everyone to the webinar Organizing for Climate Action, the Opportunities of U.S.-China Cooperation. This webinar is co-sponsored by Justices Global, ActionAid USA, the 1990 Institute, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and Veterans for Peace. My name is Sandy Shan, and I'm the Executive Director of Justices Global, a grassroots organization that has been fighting for structural changes to the global economy that for some time pitted countries against each other and give rise to the climate crisis and US-China tensions we are seeing today. I'm a naturalized US citizen born and raised in China. And in 2011, I was able to come to the US on a student visa to study in the discipline that I have been long been dreaming of because of the close friendships my grad school advisor in the US developed with my professors in China back in the 1990s. But the recent 5 years have seen the space where even this kind of person-to-person exchange between the two countries drastically shrinking. Not to mention that the deep collaborations in areas such as scientific research, public health, and climate have practically come to a halt. While some people indulging in a new Cold War fantasy are making headlines about how to prepare for what they call the worst case scenarios, fear and fatalism spread fast, and they are contagious. Soon enough, cooperation became such a far-fetched idea. I can't tell you how many times my colleague and I were dismissed in some DC policy circles as naive or being told that there is no political appetite for cooperation right now. But I know all of us here tonight because we refuse to accept that conflict is the only way forward. The stakes are just too damn high, as you will hear from our speakers tonight. More importantly, we are here because we do see a viable path forward, and that path is US-China cooperation over sustainable development and providing support for clean energy transition in the global south to prevent worldwide temperatures from reaching catastrophic levels. Cooperation over climate is not only in the interest of both countries, but also the entire world, as it opens up opportunities to radically rethink how we rebuild a global economy for people everywhere and for generations to come. So we have the great honor this evening to have Congressman Jamal Bowman from New York's 16th Congressional District to make opening remarks. Congressman Bowman has never shied away from using what he himself calls the principal's voice to call out injustices, cowardly actions. He is a champion of children and working families, and on the issue of US-China relations, Congressman Bowman has been pushing back against anti-China rhetoric and policy measures that fuel anti-Asian racism, and has been working with colleagues in Congress to promote US-China cooperation around shared global issues. Welcome, Congressman Bowman. I'll pass it to you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction. Just wanted to jump on in the middle of like 70,000 votes as we try to keep the government open, just to say hello and to thank you all for your continued belief and continued organizing around this issue. I'm very grateful for you, and I'm very grateful for your work with our office in developing this legislation. I mean, for me, it's very simple. The climate catastrophe that we live in is not going to be solved by one country or another. It's not going to be solved by rabid, self-destructive competition. It's going to be solved by cooperation. It's going to be solved by collaboration. And the global South needs our support. Our, meaning the US and China, working together to build the infrastructure in the global South to deal with the issue of climate change. And so I am grateful to be an author of a bill that will be a part of that facilitation and nurturing that collaboration. So thank you. This is a conversation that needs to be had. The reason why I push back on all the anti-China rhetoric is because, in my opinion, it's a waste of time. We have too many people senselessly suffering and dying due to climate change and so many other issues, and the continued, just conflict and competition between the two large nations, but also the conflict and competition that happens all over the world is not beneficial to our overall collective humanity. So I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to be in this position, very grateful to have a voice, and very grateful to you all for your collaboration and your support and belief in us. And the work continues. So thank you all. I gotta jump. I just wanted to come and thank you and let you know how grateful I am to you, so that we can continue to do the work going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Bowman, for those inspiring words and for highlighting the urgency of the issue. We're so grateful for your leadership in promoting U.S.-China climate cooperation. Thank you. Yeah, take care, bye. So now let me introduce our panelists tonight. We have the great pleasure tonight to be joined by policy experts, academics, community activists to talk about U.S.-China climate cooperation. So first we have Brandon Wu, ActionAid USA's Director of Policy and Campaigns. Brandon leads ActionAid works on climate finance for developing countries, fairness and equity in the global climate regime, and energy democracy in the global South. And next we have Professor Russell John, who teaches Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. In 2020, Russell launched Stop AAPI Hate, a project tracking COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop community resources and policy interventions to fight racism. And then we have Terry Fitzgibbons speaking on behalf of Veterans for Peace tonight. Terry is a public high school history teacher in Passaic, New Jersey, and a proud union member of the New Jersey Education Association. From 2004 to 2008, Terry served as a surface warfare officer in the US Navy, including in 7th Fleet, Japan. And last but certainly not the least, Jake Warner, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Jake's research examines the emergence of great power conflict between the US and China and develops policy recommendations to rebuild constructive economic relations. Thank you all for being here today. Before I pass it to our speakers, I want to make a note that we extended invitations to a gender-balanced list of speakers for this event tonight, but in the end, due to speakers' availability, we decided not to postpone this urgent and important conversation before we could get it right. And of course, this is one of many conversations that we'll be having on this very issue, and we commit to having a better representation next time. So I will stop there. Let's welcome our first speaker, Brandon Wu from ActionAid USA.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's an honor to follow Congressman Bowman. I'm Brandon Wu. I work for ActionAid USA, and as Sandy mentioned, I focus primarily on the international climate negotiations, where the US-China dynamic has been, really, really formative in how those negotiations have played out. We can go to the first slide, please. So we constantly hear in the discourse around the climate crisis that China is the problem when it comes to climate change, that they're the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's their unconstrained growth that has to be controlled in order to fix the climate crisis. There's a lot of truth to this, but it also ignores a larger problem, which is historical emissions. Carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere for thousands of years. It's not just emissions now that matter, but emissions over time. And it's the United States, in fact, that is by far the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. Next slide. And I have a couple slides to illustrate this. So this one you can see China is up there, but a fairly distant second place to the United States still. Next slide, please. And this is just another visualization of the same data, although this only goes up to 2017. But you can see the US has a far larger share of responsibility for causing the climate crisis than any other country in the world, including China. And we've developed into one of the world's wealthiest countries with massive economic, political, and military power on the back of fossil fuel-based industrialization. So the US has both high responsibility for causing the climate crisis, that's the historical emissions that you see in the chart, as well as a high capacity to address it, our national wealth and our resources. So by any reasonable estimation of what countries' fair shares of climate action should be, the US is at the very top, far above even China today. Now, unfortunately, the US tends to deny this historical responsibility for climate change almost as a matter of foreign policy. And it's consistently used China as an excuse for not doing more in the UN climate negotiations and on climate action in general. The US refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, the original UN climate treaty, in large part because it would have placed legal obligations on the United States, but not on China. And keep in mind, this was the 1990s when Chinese emissions were significantly lower than they are now. And more recently, in the negotiations around what became the Paris Agreement in 2015, the US played a key role in watering down that climate regime into something that is purely voluntary and debatably effective. We pushed hard to remove principles of equity and historical responsibility, again, so that we wouldn't take on obligations that China did not also take. And shamefully, our pledge to the Paris Agreement is significantly weaker than China's, actually, relative to each country's fair share of climate action. Next slide, please. This is a bit of a complicated slide, but if you look at the red lines, those are each country's pledges to the Paris Agreement about what emissions they will reduce. This is on a per capita basis. And the green bars are our calculation as civil society of what those countries' fair shares would be. So you can see the US is falling far short of our obligations. A country like China is actually much closer to its fair share, which doesn't mean that those countries are perfect or even necessarily doing well, but certainly they're doing better than the United States is. And as another part of our obligations, we failed on a moral and legal obligation to deliver funding to support climate action in poorer countries. And all the while, the US government consistently calls on China to make contributions, a stance that's pretty tone deaf with regards to our own historical responsibility, as well as China's still very real development challenges. So the US has failed to meet even the most basic commitments on climate finance. Next slide, please. Including a pledge to the Green Climate Fund that dates back to 2014. You can see here we pledged $3 billion almost 10 years ago. We haven't even met that pledge yet. Other countries have met their pledges and made new pledges to replenish the Green Climate Fund, which is the main multilateral fund to support climate action in developing countries. And we are just falling further and further behind. Now, there are ongoing negotiations about a new fund, a loss and damage fund, which would help developing countries recover and rebuild from climate disasters. And those negotiations are deadlocked in part over the issue of who should pay in. And again, the US is insisting that China should do so. There are pretty common sense principles of fairness that indicate that the historically developed countries should take the lead on paying to fix the problem that they caused. But the US doesn't really accept this very basic premise. Next slide. I want to say China's not blameless, right? China is rolling out renewable energy at a staggering pace, but it's also continuing to invest in fossil fuels at home and abroad. But the larger point here is that this hardline US rhetoric and retrograde positions that we take in international negotiations actually exacerbate nationalist sentiment in China and almost certainly make cooperation more difficult. Last year, China said that it could contribute voluntarily to a new loss and damage fund, but those kinds of statements are likely made much more difficult if the prevailing rhetoric and policymaking and negotiating positions of the United States are so blatantly anti-China as they have been in recent months and years. So we need the U.S. to stop using China as an excuse for our own inaction or to water down international agreements. We should recognize our own historical responsibility, make genuine efforts to cut our own emissions, and provide finance to support action in poorer countries, regardless of what China is or isn't doing. And more than that, we should seek to engage China constructively rather than demonizing an entire country, government, and people. We desperately need the world's largest countries to cooperate and work in solidarity in order to solve the global commons problem that is the climate crisis in a way that is fair and equitable and just for people around the world, including in the poorest countries of the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for explaining to us how U.S.-China tensions have been showing up in some of these climate negotiations around U.S. historical responsibility. So next we have Russell John from San Francisco State University. Russell.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm honored this evening to join Representative Jamal Bowman and the other distinguished panelists to promote U.S.-China cooperation, especially regarding climate justice. As Brandon just articulated so well, the U.S.-China tensions have undermined our progress in addressing climate change, and in particular has been used as an excuse to mask America's responsibility in meeting critical sustainability goals. Next slide. I'd like to add how U.S.-China antagonistic relations have harmed the Asian American community in particular, both historically and today, through the implementation of yellow peril policies. Next slide. So historically, when European nations colonized China in the 19th century, the U.S. tried to act exceptionally differently and signed the 1868 Burlingame Treaty, which offered free migration and equal protection of citizens. My own great-grandparents, including my great-grandmother, Gok Tai, were thus able to migrate at that time to Monterey, California. But relations quickly soured, and the U.S. annulled the Burlingame Treaty so that it could restrict Chinese migrants. And because the U.S. viewed Chinese as disease-ridden, as seen in this picture on the right, as unassumable heathens, and as unfair coolie competition who stole white workers' jobs, Congress passed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese and subsequent Asian groups were then declared aliens ineligible for citizenship. And that legal designation as aliens later became the basis for discriminatory yellow peril policies against Asians. Next slide. This American yellow peril policy of exclusion didn't actually quell racist sentiment, but actually sanctioned and legitimated further mob violence against Chinese communities. In fact, in just 1 year, 168 Chinese settlements, not just individuals, but entire communities were driven out by white mob violence, even supported by the mayor of Tacoma on the picture on the left. On the photo on the right, you can see that the aftermath of a mysterious fire that destroyed the Monterey Chinese fishing village. So after 4 decades of raising a family, building a business, and having a home, my great-grandmother lost everything and had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only refuge from racism. Next slide. This link between U.S. foreign relations and Asian Americans' domestic standing can be seen again during World War II. Since China became the ally of the U.S. in the war against Japan, the U.S. felt compelled to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act and allow Chinese to naturalize. Again, the status of Chinese Americans improved, and Chinese were then allowed to enter federal government employment. In fact, my own paternal grandmother, Ha Kwok-shi, began to work for the first time outside of Chinatown in the Hunter Points Naval Shipyard working for the American defense industry. On the other hand, the fortunes of Japanese Americans suffered a great downturn as the US government incarcerated over 110,000 Japanese. They were declared enemy aliens, even when they were American citizens. And then US-China relations reversed again during the Korean War. So once again, China and Chinese were the enemy. And during that period in the 1950s, the US government and the FBI began to enforce the 1970 Trading with the Enemy Act. And so thousands of Chinese Americans in Chinatowns were profiled and suspected as being spies. My own family could no longer send remittances or even communicate with relatives in China during that time. My maternal grandmother, Susie Xu, in fact, was terrified to actually even reunite with her brother in the late 1970s because she feared that both she and her brother would be branded as disloyal by their respective nations if they communicated closely. Next slide, please. Today, US-China relations is at a 2-decade low, with half of Americans naming China as America's greatest threat. Subsequently, scapegoating China for COVID-19 was an easy way to mask our government's mismanagement of the pandemic. Consequently, it's been practical for politicians to initiate new alien land laws, which are just empty symbolic policy measures, as Representative Bowman argued, that politicians use to show their heart on China. And because of this rhetoric, we've seen the surge of anti-Asian interpersonal violence that's led to a period of collective racial trauma. So to some, antagonistic US-China relations have long had disastrous negative impacts on Chinese and Asian American communities. Rather than highlighting conflict and zero-sum games of competition, we need to aim for strategic relations of cooperation between our nations. We need to cooperate on issues of common concern, such as AI, international trade, pandemics, and climate change. As my own teenage son so recently remarked, politicians need to stop their squabbles and empty rhetoric and instead tackle head-on our real existential issues like climate justice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Russell, for sharing your personal stories and also amplifying how Asian American experience is always intertwined with the US-China relations. So next, we will have Terry Fitzgibbons speaking on behalf of Veterans for Peace tonight. Terry?
Thank you, Sandy. Next slide. In September of 2021, Hurricane Ida brought destruction to New Jersey and much of the East Coast. A student of mine had to miss the first week of school because her sister and her sister's friend were killed by the floods. They were two brand new graduates of Passaic Public Schools, where I teach. Just a couple months before, they were the king and the queen at the prom. This is one local slice of the climate catastrophe, which is happening not 20 years down the road, but now. Next slide. As an officer in the US Navy in 5th and 7th Fleets, I was brought up to see national security in the traditional way. That is, we must defend democracy, freedom, and human rights, defend the so-called American way of life from attack by projecting forward presence and, if necessary, using violence. Next slide. On the USS Cowpens, homeported in Yokosuka, Japan, we regularly steamed in the open ocean with the Kitty Hawk Strike Group, and we participated in annual exercises such as Foal Eagle and Talisman Saber. These were meant, we were told, to deter our adversaries like North Korea, China, and Russia. Foal Eagle, for example, is a joint US-South Korea combination of air, land, amphibious, and special operations maneuvers with approximately 12,000 and 300,000 US troops and 300,000 South Korean troops. 12,000 US troops, 300,000 South Korean troops, excuse me, and hundreds of planes, tanks, and ships. What I noticed quickly, next slide, that these exercises and our regular steaming required a huge amount of oil to sustain. We conducted an underway replenishment, or UNREP, of oil and other supplies every 3 to 4 days while deployed. And in each UNREP, we could take on up to 120,000 gallons of fuel. The Military Sea Lift Command, which oversees the tankers, boasts that in 2022, it transported 26 million barrels, 1.09 billion gallons of fuels. Next slide. What I noticed too, but didn't really reflect on until later, was the obvious. We were not anywhere close to the US when we were conducting these war games and this steaming. We were, relatively speaking, close to the shores of China, North Korea, and Russia. If one were to read statements from these countries, to have cognitive empathy, not to be confused with emotional empathy, that is, to see how they think, even if we don't agree with them, we might recognize that our adversaries see these war games as provocative. Next slide. As a lowly junior officer on one ship, I had the power to order machine parts worth thousands of dollars. Granted, the orders had to get approved, but I realized that on this small level, I could dispense easily with thousands. And that if on my level I could do this, there were billions of dollars easily dispensed with each year. Next slide. As both the Dove, Martin Luther King, and the Hawk, Eisenhower, observed, every dollar spent on war is a dollar not invested in human needs, in social needs. Furthermore, and maybe less mathematically precise, every carbon ton emitted by the US military, the single largest institutional emitter in the world, larger than 140 nations combined, is a carbon bomb blasted back on us in the form of Hurricane Ida, Hurricane Sandy, record heat waves, and so on. And US military emissions are often purposefully left out of the climate discussion. Next slide. New Jersey's public schools are relatively well funded compared to other states. They are sadly also very segregated. But New Jersey's public schools are not relatively well funded compared to the USS Cowpens or the USS Cardinal or the USS Pelican, ships I served on. Next slide. New Jersey and our nation's schools more broadly need structural repairs, new plumbing, new HVAC, more counselors and social workers, more teachers, better salaries, better food, and non-lead pipe drinking fountains, for instance. Our nation's cities need social housing, green spaces, new infrastructure, and good union jobs. It was concrete, after all, a lack of green space, high population density, and poor drainage infrastructure that contributed to the ferocity of the Hurricane Ida floods that ripped through Passaic 2 years ago. We narrowly define national security to war, military affairs, and great power politics to our own peril. National security must mean human security, human flourishing, thriving schools and cities, and a livable planet. The transition we want to a greener and fairer economy, domestically and worldwide, is jeopardized when we instead move resources to military buildup. Next slide. There are valid criticisms of Chinese state policy. I have my own. At the same time, as a veteran for peace, I also teach my students that between 1820 and 1949, for instance, the US intervened in China approximately 30 times militarily, which is rarely brought up in US media and US textbooks. I am no East Asian, military, or even public schools expert. But like many of you, I have been both a perpetrator of and witness to the climate catastrophe unfolding before us. No matter what one thinks about the Chinese state or the US state, climate change poses a much greater and present threat to Americans than China does. We need a sane, non-provocative foreign policy now. We need to cooperate now for all of our sakes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry, for sharing your thoughts as a veteran and also as a public school teacher and making us rethink what security truly means. So next we have Jake Warner from Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Jake?
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks to all the presenters. This is a really essential question for Americans, for people in China, and for people around the world. I want to emphasize how crucial the U.S. and China working together is for the rest of the world population as well. Slide, please. This graph shows the trajectory we're currently on to make the energy transition. And the important thing to note here is that the populations in the China graph, the India graph, those are the two biggest countries in the world. They're both about 1.4 billion people. And then if you combine the two graphs at the bottom, Middle East plus Africa, that's about the same population as China or as India. And then if you combine the other three graphs together, that's about the same population again. So we've got four groups, all with about the same population, with massively, massively staggering levels of inequality in how much renewable energy is being adopted and how fast. And this reflects, of course, the underlying devastating inequalities in the global economy as a whole, but it also means that we're talking about both a failure to make a just climate transition at a global level and a failure to make a decent life for the majority of people in the world if we can't figure out this issue. So that's the problem we face. The question that I face when I talk to people in DC about cooperating, US-China cooperation on climate is, well, what good is that? We can never work with China. Like, China is a bad actor. They're only going to use this issue to exploit American generosity, or cooperation with a government like China's is impossible. I want to try to demonstrate here in the next couple minutes why that's a mistake. Next slide, please. So first, China has huge resources available to invest in the climate transition and in development in the global South. This shows the recent record of Chinese development financiers, and it compares it with the World Bank. The World Bank is, by a wide margin, the largest development financing institution in the world. And for a number of years over the last decade and a half, Chinese development financing actually eclipsed that of the World Bank. And if you total up these sums, they're about the same over the last 15 years, which means that China has made tremendous resources available. But what you also see in this graph is that the amount of resources China is devoting to development finance has been declining quite sharply. And partially that's to do with mistakes and problems that were encountered in previous development projects. Partially that's a reflection of the impact of the pandemic, but partially also this is a reflection of geopolitical tensions between the US and China. And the more intense the conflict between the US and China gets, the more likely both countries are to devote their resources to military, to devote their resources to building up their ability to sabotage the desires of the other side, rather than to common shared problems such as climate. So China has resources available, but we need to create a larger atmosphere in global geopolitics to make use of that, to make sure that those resources don't dwindle. Next slide, please. Now, the record of both the U.S. and China on electricity financing, this is sort of the key measure in a global climate transition. We have to move the production of energy to clean energy. The record of both the U.S. and China on this question has not been very good. This is development financing extended by the U.S. and China in the first couple decades of this century. And as you can see, it overwhelmingly went to fossil fuel generation. But next slide, please. But we're on a different path now. This is China's energy engagement through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is its primary development and overseas economic initiative. And you can see the green section in this graph is the percentage of energy engagement that is going to renewable energy. And that has been steadily increased. And if you look at the 2023 measures for the first half of this year, it is actually now a majority, with solar, wind, and hydro is a majority clean energy mix that China has been supporting through its overseas initiatives. So we're on sort of broadly the right path. The question is, can U.S.-China cooperation actually build on this, expand the ambitions, and overcome that staggering inequality we saw in the first graph? Next slide, please. So what does that look like in terms of real policies? Well, I would refer anyone who wants to dig into the details on this to a great paper that came out recently from Joanna Lewis and Cecilia Springer, two of the top scholars working on this issue. This is a graph from that paper that shows sort of a ladder of increasing ambition and increasing impact that if the US-China relationship can be improved, it opens up these possibilities for really, really powerful impact on achieving a just climate transition globally. I just want to pull out a couple of points from this, two in particular. There's a space for the US and China to work together by co-financing projects. That means putting money in together into investments around the global south. This is something that China has done quite a bit in the past, so it certainly has shown itself to be open to this. The obstacle right now is really in the United States. Policymakers in DC have been extremely worried about saying they would do anything with China for fear of being attacked, as appeasing the Communist Party and trying to help out China's nefarious initiatives overseas. So the key for us is to overcome, to present a balance, a force in the other direction that can convince policymakers that there is an opening to work with China on these things, and co-financing projects would be a really powerful opportunity there. The other thing I want to highlight as an important possibility for the US and China working together on this issue is that now that both countries have really moved away from the free market dogmas of the past, both countries have embraced industrial policy. We absolutely need industrial policy to achieve a just climate transition, but we need it around the world, not just in the powerful countries that can defy the existing free market rules of the WTO and other international institutions. We need a new consensus behind the urgency and vitality of the use of public power on behalf of public goods in every country. And since the US and China have moved that way in their own policymaking, there's an opening for the two of them to endorse a new approach to economic statecraft globally, so that it's not just the powerful who are making these decisions. And that's important to achieve the climate transition. That's also important for the US and China to start to understand, to open up the zero-sum constraints that are pushing them into conflict, and create a global system in which everyone can thrive at the same time. It's no longer one or the other who's going to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake, for explaining to us why practical forms of US-China cooperation are feasible, and also promising policies to promote it. And thanks everyone that has spoken before. So to sum up what's been lifted up tonight, rising US-China tension are hurting our communities in the US and abroad, and are hurting our collective chances of a more sustainable and equitable future. And US-China cooperation over climate change, which includes increasing climate and development finance for low and middle income countries, presents a way forward. The stakes are just too damn high, as you have heard from all of our speakers tonight. And what we're up against at this moment is this predominant belief, or rather the narrative, that conflict is the only path forward. I will admit, in the past 3 years that I've been involved in this line of work, it's sometimes felt incredibly isolating. And for me, who is caught in this crossfire of rising US-China tensions, it's also maddening to hear there is no political appetite for climate cooperation, when it's painfully obvious that's what we urgently need right now. But I kept going, and we kept going, because we know people are with us. Ever since we at Justice Global launched our US-China climate cooperation campaign last fall, we have met so many groups, both at the national level and in our communities, that agree with us much more so than with the China hawks. And so many of you that we have met are here tonight. And so many of you are helping to connect climate cooperation to the work that you are currently doing, and to make the issue more palpable to your staff, your grassroots members, and also your communities. So back in the summer, when there was reporting about flooding in Vermont and record-breaking temperature in China on the same day, one of our grassroots leaders approached us and asked, can we connect these climate disasters in different places around the world and make a really compelling case for climate cooperation? Yes, the solution is so obvious. It's just right in front of us. People can see that. I always think that whoever takes climate change seriously is an internationalist at heart, and we know that's the majority of people already. And our job now is to win a critical mass of people over from a false sense of scarcity that pits countries against each other, from a place of accepting that talking about climate cooperation is anticlimactic to our vision of the future. I know we can do this because we at Justice Global have tried and succeeded. Last May, a group of our activists had more than 600 conversations with folks in rural parts of Wisconsin to talk about building climate cooperation between the US and China using a persuasion tool called deep canvassing. And almost 50% of people that we had a conversation with ended up changing their mind, or at least started to think critically about the dominant narratives that scapegoat China and moved closer to our vision of interdependence and cooperation. And how we did this is through exchanging personal stories to show that the future we're advocating for generates concrete and tangible benefits for ordinary Americans. What sharing story does is to put human faces to some of the very abstract foreign policy buzzwords, such as competition or tough on China, then oftentimes ring hollow. We need to share these stories publicly and more often, as they are currently drowned out by narratives that are drumming up support for conflicts in order to motivate and mobilize more people to fight for the common sense, to show that they're neither naive nor alone in wanting a future that's grounded in solidarity and interdependence. And we need to back our champions like Congressman Bowman in the government to do the right thing, to pass legislations that coordinate actions between the US and China for a global just transition. And to do that, we need to have more one-on-ones in our communities that speak to everyone's day-to-day experiences. We need to build a broader and stronger coalition that incorporates an international climate agenda to change the political terrain for what's possible. And we need to develop policy solutions and back legislations that are common sense and also reflect our vision. So if you're ready for this fight, we welcome you to join us. My colleague Valentina right now is going to drop a few links in the chat. You can join our fight by either signing up to work with us or our partners, or signing our Global Climate Cooperation Pledge, which is a new initiative of Justice Global that includes planks on international climate finance, sharing green technology, and so many things that our speakers talked about tonight. And if you're also interested in how the issue is currently playing out in the foreign policy world, I also want to direct your attention to an upcoming policy discussion between Jake Warner here and also Michael Beckley from the American Enterprise Institute. So I hope you can give all these resources that we provided here today a read, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one-on-ones, town hall meetings, or coalition meetings. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. Let's just give it that till the end of this webinar. So now let's open up for Q&As. Before we jump into some questions, I understand there are some folks in the audience today that would like to share their stakes in US-China cooperation. So let me just really quickly so how about I'm seeing a few questions while we are lining up some of the speakers from our audience right now. I'm seeing a few questions about how to kind of address some of the questions that oftentimes that people hear about China in terms of the dominant narratives. So I'm seeing this question from, for example, Wendy Wu, who said, I have been in the US for only 1 year and I have encountered many people asking the frequently heard narrative, we will never solve climate change unless China does it. Brandon's presentation serves as a strong counter argument to that, but my question is, how should I respond the next time in a conversation when I don't have supporting resources or slides to emphasize my point? So that's one example here, and I see also from Janet Whale I hope that I pronounced your last name correctly, but she was asking, she sometimes got pushed back when she is staying in China. Well, rather, U.S. militarism's costs and impacts on the climate crisis are huge. But she got pushed back because people say China has the world's largest navy, and militarism in China and other, I would say, authoritarian countries is much cheaper. So how do we respond to some of these narratives? So maybe let's start with these two questions while we're waiting for other speakers to show up. Anyone want to jump in?
Maybe I can just give a brief
Yes.
response to Wendy's question. You know, I think when you hear somebody say we'll never solve climate change unless China does, you know, I think the first thing to say is probably, yeah, that's true. We need China to be doing everything it can to resolve the climate crisis, but we also need ourselves to be doing everything we can to solve the climate crisis, and we're not, right? Even this current administration, which wants to be seen as a climate champion, we still have to fight against them about opening up new fossil fuel licenses. We have to fight against them about new pipelines. We have to fight with them to provide climate finance to developing countries for climate action in the rest of the world. We have to fight with them tooth and nail about everything. And so, sure, we absolutely need China to move dramatically away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. And I thought Jake's presentation was really fascinating on the trajectory there, which is in the right direction, but needs to speed up. That's absolutely true. But we live in the United States, and we can control what our country does first and foremost, and that's where we have to start.
I would, if I could just add on to that, I think I absolutely agree with Brandon's point that we need to move our country first, but in the process, we can help create a welcoming environment for China to move as well. Like we have to remember that we're in a relationship with countries around the world, and what they do is partly a reflection of what we do, right? Like if everyone else in the world thinks it's unfair that the rich countries have got rich off fossil fuels and are now denying the poor countries the opportunity to do the same, that's going to create a really hostile environment for solving the global climate crisis. And that comes from China, but that comes from countries across the global south that think that's unfair. So the United States has in its own control what's happening in U.S. emissions, but it also has the power to create a welcoming environment for what is needed multilaterally to overcome the crisis.
Yeah, I would also jump in and using some of Brandon's points as well earlier, and maybe the skills of the deep canvassing, Sandy, that you talked about, which we all could probably practice and learn from, but let that person or that potential opponent in the discussion be heard that there is truth, obviously in China's emissions, right? Our goal isn't necessarily to say, China is, blameless, or, such and such country is blameless, that this is, it's not zero sum either way, so to let that person be heard, but then, kind of invite them into the longer historical conversation, whether that be the historical conversation about historical emissions or even, from the militarism perspective, historical interventions, and also to point out, and I think Justices Global has done this work, that it hasn't been enough, but China and the U.S. have cooperated in the past to resuscitate the Paris climate talks, which are still weak agreements, but nevertheless, like we have done some working together in the past. So highlighting that and pushing our message further as a start.
Yeah, I disagree with all the other speakers that it's not only in our interest, but it's actually America's responsibility to address its own emissions and to meet its own goals. And by doing so, then we do invite, as Jake said, and welcome China to come on board. It's through our actions and through our relationships that we can actually prod other nations to come alongside and to act interdependently. So I think we as a nation have to model what we're hoping for, and to really, again, take accountability and responsibility for this global issue. Again, as Brandon said, we have the power, we have the wealth, and so I think then we have the responsibility to. But this sort of rhetoric of responsibility and interdependence and cooperation are hard sells because politicians are using words like conflict and competition. So we really do need to change the rhetorical tone, and also change, again, how people relate to one another.
Thank you all, and I will add some of the deep canvas conversation that we had in the past. And it sounds like, Wendy, that you just arrived in the United States and got questions about sort of falling along the line of some of these dominant narratives that we have heard about China. So I would say some of the deep canvas conversation that we had in the past year are addressing exactly those dominant issues and how they have been kind of playing out in our day-to-day, person-to-person conversations. And again, I want to emphasize sort of the key learning that we took away from those conversations is sharing stories. And I would also encourage you to ask whoever posed those questions, ask them the sort of try to get a sense of what is the emotional core of some of these questions that they're asking, and what are some of the motivated experience that encourage them to ask these questions. The reason why I'm saying that is that sometimes, you know, we have to meet people in the middle, and we have to be real. Like some of these conversations that we had with folks in Wisconsin kind of reflect very deep anxiety and frustrations with the long-term economic dysfunctions that people have been struggling in the United States. So kind of trying to understand what their experiences that have motivated those responses, and try also to share your experience if you have any kind of pertaining to this issue. Because there is one sentence that I really like is, you know, you can argue with someone about a policy position or so on, but you can't argue with someone's story. So I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is to move people by building some of these emotional connections, and by tying their personal experience with a larger geopolitical and climate issue. We want to be able to see, help people to move to a place of, you know, sort of they can see there's a path forward, there's a brighter future for them and for them, their families. So that's kind of my 2 cents. There's another question that I saw, which is interesting. Ryan Harvey in the audience asked, is there a sense of how politicians / other power brokers in China feel about US-China climate cooperation? Are there forces within China pushing things in this direction? I think that is a very good question. And in fact, in our deep canvas conversations, people really appreciate knowing that there are civil society and grassroots on the ground in China that are fighting the exact same thing. I think that builds very much a strong sense of solidarity. But I think, you know, our speakers, our panelists might have other answers that they want to provide to this question. Yeah. I think maybe Jake, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, the answer is yes. Certainly there are people in the Chinese government that think climate is a very serious problem, and that working together with the United States would help. That's the case. They certainly are not the most powerful people in the Chinese government, though. But they do make available these policies, and they try to move them internally. The bigger question, really, the thing that is driving the Chinese government is not, you know, genuine humanitarian interest in climate or something. It's how does the Chinese government maintain its legitimacy? How does the Chinese economy maintain growth? And how does China as a country improve its status in the international system? Those are the fundamental drivers. And there are some people who think that confrontation with the United States is the only option, increasingly the only option. There are other people who think that creating a welcoming environment between the US and China is the best way to realize those goals. So there's an argument within the Chinese government about what direction to take. And this very strongly reflects currents in the United States as well. Even though the people who think that a constructive relationship with China is important in the United States, many of them are keeping their heads down, but there are still a huge number of people in influential parts of the government and civil society who think that conflict with China would be terribly, terribly against their interests. And again, their interests are generally not humanitarian concern for solving the climate crisis. It's about power, it's about wealth, it's about legitimacy for them as well. But there are people in the US who really think that a constructive relationship with China is possible. And there's an intense argument going on right now with people who think that confrontation is the way to preserve American power and keep the American system legitimate, and the same sorts of concerns that are going on the Chinese side. So we have these arguments that I think that the really important thing is that the worse the conflict gets, the stronger the pro-conflict forces get. So unless we can sort of break this trajectory towards a deteriorating relationship, the trajectory will just snowball forward. What we have to do is really change the direction. And it's much harder, of course, to change the direction than to accelerate the existing direction. But if we can change the direction, if we can kind of open up space in the United States system to suggest a positive, constructive relationship with China around things like climate, that's going to open up space on the Chinese side. That's going to increase the credibility of people who are saying that we can do things with the US. We don't just have to confront the United States. There definitely are people who are saying, look, the US has revealed its true face now. All it wants to do is suppress Chinese growth, keep China down, destroy the Communist Party. There are a lot of voices in the Chinese government that are saying that. And I'm not going to lie, US actions are giving them good reason to say that. But there is another approach that is being discussed. And if we can open up space in the American government, that's going to open up space in the Chinese government, right? So it's either a vicious circle or it's a positive circle. And it's really up to us to help create the conditions for that change.
Thank you, Jake. Sorry that we have to cut this short because we're really close to our 1 hour mark. Sorry. So as a concluding question, I want to ask everyone here today, because we are actually coming from different sectors and representing different constituencies and talking to different audiences. So as a concluding question, very quickly, I hope everyone can speak to this question. What work is required in within your sphere of influence to move either your constituencies, your membership, or your audiences closer to the vision that we outlined here tonight? So let's start with Brandon.
Sure. I actually want to bring in several questions that have been asked in the Q&A and the chat as well about how are we engaging youth, right, who are feeling disempowered or daunted. What are organizations doing to change this? And I just want to highlight that just this past weekend, we had 75,000 people marching in New York around the UN General Assembly for climate action. That was led by young people. But more than that, on Friday the 15th, there were over 500,000 people marching around the world in 60 plus countries around the world, again, led by youth. And so we actually do have a groundswell of people who not only care about this issue, but understand what needs to be done to fix it, including global cooperation, right? These are folks who understand instinctively that we're not going to get to a solution by competing with each other and by saber rattling. We have to act in solidarity with each other. And so I just want to give people a sense of hope that this is doable, this is winnable. We have people on our side. We have a lot of people on our side. And the question is how to mobilize that power and direct it in the right ways.
Russell?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with Brandon. I think our youth and our students today, I teach in ethnic studies, are really galvanized and ready to act on this issue. They recognize the need for global interdependence, and by educating them and then giving them the political tools to move and to lobby and to take action, I think would be a real step in the right direction. So in some ways, I think we all need to
Russell,
embody
let's
that.
just keep it there. Yeah, sorry. We really have to cut it short. Yeah, Terry?
Yeah, I would say two things: that we kind of see where the movements are and walk along with them, and also push the conversation. So like the climate conversation, the big greens, the question of U.S. militarism is not necessarily in the conversation. So like we walk with them and we kind of say yes, and like try to push the conversation. You got to include this, and I would also say. It doesn't seem like strictly like a China or a green fight, but I think we need to stand with working people. There's rising labor unrest, which I view as a positive thing because it's pushing back against a system that is based solely on profit. And so it doesn't seem straightforward for climate, but I think we need to stand with the UAW workers on strike, stand with SAG-AFTRA, Teamsters with their almost strike, and I think from there we can build coalitions towards mitigating climate change.
Jake?
Yeah, I really agree with what Terry just said. There's been a tendency in our politics in recent decades to reduce things to single issues and to fight around individual issues. These aren't individual issues; they're all interconnected. And if we fight them as individual issues, then we're gonna fragment our capacity to change the whole system that is determining each of these individual issues. So we absolutely have to think beyond, and that means that people who don't think about China ever but care a lot about climate, they need to start thinking about China. But that likewise means that people who think primarily about development or think primarily about U.S. military policy or something, they need to start thinking very seriously about climate as well, because these things are interconnected, and completely agree with Terry that the labor movement is an essential part of it. The other thing I would say is that the problem that I run into over and over again in DC is not that everyone thinks that we have to confront China. There are a lot of people who are extremely worried about this, but they're just afraid. And the thing that we need to do, we out there who don't have the next election that we have to face, we need to open up space. We need to convince them two things. One, that there's going to be a cost to them politically if they promote international conflict. And two, that there's going to be an upside to them if they promote a constructive relationship with China. And I think this is a really urgent task because the 2024 election is bearing down on us. And it's precisely election dynamics that convince every member of Congress, I got to be a tough on China or else my opponent's going to attack me for being weak on China. So we have to change the calculation that politicians, and that goes at the level that goes for congressional candidates, it goes for presidential candidates as well. We need to change the calculation that they're making, that there's only a downside to having a constructive relationship with China for them politically. If we can open up that space, convince them that there are costs to promoting international conflict and benefits to them politically, to supporting constructive relationship, then that's going to open up a lot of space for people who currently are really concerned about the direction that things are going, but are not expressing that concern just because they're afraid.
Thank you so much, Jake. And as a final word, I would say from Justice Global's point of view, as I emphasized throughout the entire webinar, sharing stories, what we want to do in the next phase of our work is to cultivate messengers in our grassroots space that can really amplify these stories and tie people's experience to the climate crisis that we are facing today, and also understanding their stakes in U.S.-China tensions. Because the more stories that we can tell, the better stories that we can tell, the more likely that we'll be able to beat the bad story that's currently dominating all these DC foreign policies circle right now. And I would say I have every confidence that we can do this because our opponents' messages really very much rely on fear and anxiety, which have been there have been research that shows that these negative emotions in the long run actually have the impact of disengaging audiences. So I have every confidence that we'll be able to do this. So thank you all for being here tonight, and my deepest of gratitude to all of our speakers tonight. And also I want to say thank you to our co-sponsors to make this event possible. As I said earlier, this will be the first conversation of many on this urgent and important issue, and I hope that we made a very compelling case for all of you today to join us for our fight for the common sense and for a better path forward. So please continue following our work and our partners' work by following some of the links that we have already dropped in the chat. So thank you and good night.